Welcome to The World We Got This with Esau Williams.
Hello and welcome to the podcast that looks at the major and minor stories from around the world from the School of Global Affairs at King's College London. Now in this edition we'll be talking about the recently concluded Climate Change Conference, COP29. What did it achieve? And can meaningful change be had with the absence of some of the world's major polluting states? And we'll also be talking about the changing relations between the United Kingdom and Africa. Are relations really changing, or is it just being talked about differently? Well, I'm joined by Fanny Dreyer, who's a climate change expert from the Department of Geography here at King's College London. She also virtually attended COP29 as a delegate from King's. Professor Ikpe, Director of the African Leadership Centre and Professor in Development Economics in Africa. Dr. Julia Gallagher, Reader in International Development, focusing on African politics and development, and Dr. Clement Sefa-Nyarko, Lecturer in Development Security and Leadership, also from the African Leadership Centre at King's College London. And you also did attend, I hear, Professor Nyarko, COP in Azerbaijan. So we will, I'm sure, be talking a lot about that later on in the podcast. But in the meantime, welcome to all of you. Baku, a city most wouldn't have heard of, has become world famous of late. The capital of Azerbaijan, a country in the South Caucasus region of Western Asia and Eastern Europe, has been paying host to the 2024 United Nations Climate Change Conference, COP29. Over 40,000 delegates attended, and there was a focus on scaling up climate change. Also under discussion, a new collective qualified goal on climate finance. King's College London was officially admitted to COP29 as an NGO observer of the negotiations. And I'm happy to say Fanny Dreyer was one of the delegates who joined virtually and is with us. So first of all, Fanny, how did the discussions go? What major decisions came out of them?
Well, I think as everyone witnessed also in the news, it was quite disappointing in terms of climate finance and loss and damage, and just not enough. There was this amazing quote, I thought, by Antonio Guterres, who said, climate finance isn't a charity, but it's an investment, and it's an investment into all of our futures. And it's also a very important time and a very important tool where we can pay back colonial legacies and reparations. And that has been quite disappointing. I'm quite critical of the COP at this point. It's been interesting. When I got into it at first, I was always quite hopeful, and every COP goes by and you hear all these negotiations and you're just like, okay, and now even global leaders don't attend it anymore. So it's definitely very interesting to watch.
I was going to say that, because how seriously then can we take it that what's being discussed is going to be acted upon when some of the major polluters, the United States, for example, the Chinese didn't show up, they're not there to make the big decisions that have to be made. Is this now, has there come a time where now this is being seen as just a talking shop rather than something that can credibly act on behalf of a boiling world?
I think that their presence there or not wouldn't really make a difference, to be honest. But I mean, I'm also not really an expert on the subject, but I would say that as critical as you can be, I'm also quite inspired by certain leaders like the Panama leaders' speech, who just, it's also a great platform for, again, pushing on the climate justice agenda, and lots of activists being there, although there are a lot of regulations and activists aren't allowed to do a lot. So I think it's still important that people come together and talk about climate change. Whether that actually leads to something is another question. Also, the fact that it's hosted by a fossil fuel heavy country is another question. But it's just important that nations come together and talk.
And Clement, you were there. What sense did you get of how seriously countries take this? I mean, Fanny just referenced the Panamanian delegate. He just said a few moments ago that he thinks that the West really wants the planet to burn.
When you see the stark differences in perspectives and capabilities across the different countries, it just tells you that a reconciliation of all those efforts and perspectives will be almost impossible. But I guess, as Fanny said, and we all agree, COP remains about the best multilateral platform we can have. to engage in this kind of way. Now, the differences still persist along, from my own assessment, along three main lines, and that remains even around this financing conversation. First of all, it's about who emits what, the carbon emission quotas. Developed countries are trying to, to say, well, we are emitting, but we can cut it down through some other means, and also accusing developing countries of still emitting, even as they have to take responsibility for the historic emissions that have almost burned the world. So that's just one area of contention. The other bit is around fossil reduction, reduction in carbon emission fossil technology versus those who argue, especially the petroleum heavyweights, who argue that there can be technologies like carbon capture, utilization, and storage technologies to help reduce the impact of carbon emission. So effectively, they are saying, well, we don't need to reduce carbon emission. We can still continue to emit fossil fuel, but capture the carbon in ways that will be helpful. But of course, that technology is still not as viable as we think. Then there's also the third bit, which is the financing, which is problematic. Who finances what around mitigation, adaptation, and loss and damages?
We were going to come to financing. Let me just bring in Fanny on this one, though. So when you talk to people, for example, and the sort of discussion around this in terms of, not just financing, but who's responsible, as Clement just said, in terms of responsibility, do you get a sense then that it's down to a simple development argument, Fanny, that you spent, they say, to the richer countries, your time industrializing on the back of fossil fuel. Now you want to stop us, the global south would say, from doing the same thing. Is that where we are with the debate?
I do experience two types of discussions. People that are in this terms of living in a bubble, and I think in my bubble of academia and who the people I surround myself with normally on a day-to-day basis, we all kind of agree on the subject. But then you obviously have the other bubble of the people that are less attached to the colonial legacies, and then they don't really see that type of argument, and they just say, yeah, well, you guys just need to develop better now in a different way. You know what I mean?
Right. So, Clement, can you sort of untangle this for us? How has a climate warming issue become entangled with colonial legacies? Explain that sort of nexus for us.
Yeah, I mean, look, colonialism was built on extraction of value from the global south to the metropolitan north. And that included the use of technologies to build ships, to travel long distances, to build military technologies that relied on, firepower that used, the technologies that emitted carbon. But also it relied on, it was built on industrialization, that industrial revolution that revolutionized our understanding of the world and, communication, transportation, and everything. The whole industrial colonial project was built on an expansionist ideology that first had to deforest because of urbanization and industrialization, that had to use technology that emitted high carbons, and that really just exploited. All right. And so we've gotten to a point where technology and science has made us appreciate that until we cut down on the amount of emissions we do and the rate of deforestation and the devaluing of our forests and natural resources, we will get to a point where the global temperature rise beyond reversibility,
Sure.
And so the global south is also coming to this picture to say, this is the time that we need to expand our economies to develop. And this is the time that we know that we also need to cut down carbonization.
Right.
So who should bear the cost? So that's really just built on that whole concept of colonialism and its expansionist ideology. Yeah.
Excellent. So, Fanny, Dreyer, let me come to you on this one. So, in part, or in terms of looking at solutions to the problem of climate change, to what extent are indigenous groups, for example, who have been adversely affected by this and a lot of the land seizures we hear about in South America, Latin America, to what extent are they being sort of factored into the problem-solving phase of climate change? I know you've done some work on this.
Yeah, so I wanted to come in anyways on what Clement said here, because I just wanted to quote Juan Carlos from Panama. He said, mitigation is not just about adopting renewable energies or improving energy efficiency, but it is fundamentally about phasing out fossil fuels. So that's exactly what he mentioned in his speech, which ties in greatly here. And my research wasn't in South America, but it was in Southern Africa. But it kind of represents the idea of indigenous peoples and their knowledge about nature and biodiversity conservation that I think personally we in our urban surroundings are just sometimes really not in touch with nature anymore. And that's why I think we can learn a lot from indigenous communities that live and know how to nurture and protect nature, and that's why they need to have more of a voice to then, lead the way in terms of climate adaptation and mitigation.
And let me stay with you, Fanny. So where are the problems again between financing that has to occur and that thing you mentioned earlier, which probably many people hear a lot about but don't really understand, and I'll be glad if you could sort of unpack that for us, loss and damage. So where is the gap between the financing and that?
So there needs to be debt cancellation, and the loss and damage fund needs to happen so that developing nations can focus on climate action and can focus on developing instead of focusing on paying back debts. Mm-hmm. And that's where the climate finance gap is.
And can I just chip in as well? I'm sure we are going to go there, but the other bit about that, in addition to what Fanny has said, is the question of equity in the process of transitioning. And by equity, I mean, if countries like Nigeria, like Saudi Arabia, like Ghana, that rely on, let's say, fossil fuel substantially for their development, have to give these up so that the world can be sustainably managed, then there has to be a way of supporting leveling up so that they are not losing more than others who have traditionally not relied on these technologies. And that means that countries that have the resources to support should pay to support. But partly also because just that whole colonial legacies and the capture, the benefit that has accrued to developed countries, the idea is that because that Western countries have developed on the back of carbon emission that has warmed the earth, we all need to come to a point where they also give up some of the gains to support countries that have been exploited and have not been and need some support. First to make up for their losses in giving up their their technologies to develop, but also just to pay for those historical advantages. And so that's where we have about 3 levels of funding. We have the adaptation components, which have to be funded, mitigation, then the loss and damages as well. And we can go into what each means and how that works. But some of them are more attractive to investors, and so they invest more, but some are not, and that's where the problem is. Around mitigation, for instance, is not attractive. So unless government really fund it, then no one will fund it. So that's the whole point.
So just very quickly before we end this section of the podcast, Clement, just briefly, are you yourself optimistic at all that there's ever going to be a proper payment for climate change, for the damage of climate change? Because the last thing I heard was that the 250 billion being touted at COP29, many countries are saying isn't enough.
Look, I mean, the amount that developing countries were proposing at the start of COP29 was around $1 trillion, per year. All right. So already, if that is the basis, then 250,000 billion is only like a fraction, like a quarter of what people are advocating for. Whether we can reach, even with 250 billion is a lot compared to what the West promised around in the Paris Agreement, about like 100 billion or so per year. This never was achieved until 2022, which was only achieved because countries recalibrated what they were spending on and decided that some were, climate actions, when in fact they have not been traditionally. And so 250 that's mentioned now is a good leap, but it's really way below what is expected. And so yes, we are not there yet, and there has to be commitment. Otherwise, then
there'll be problems down the line.
Yeah.
And Fanny, briefly to you, are you optimistic? I mean, is this going to be resolved with money, with that sort of meager amount that many countries are claiming isn't enough?
Yeah, I think money rules the world and it needs to be solved with money. And I'm an inherently optimistic person. So I would hope that at some point we get there. But realistically, we're definitely not there yet. And it's going to take some more.
Right. Fanny, thank you very much indeed. Do stay with us, all of you, because we're going to take a quick break to remind listeners what this podcast is.
Słuchacie.
Du hørst.
Du hører på.
您正在收听
You are listening to the World We Got This podcast.
Welcome back to the podcast. And I have Fanny Dreyer from the Department of Geography, Professor Ikpe, Director of the African Leadership Center, Dr. Julia Gallagher, Reader in International Development, who's focusing on African politics and development, and Dr. Clement Sefa-Nyarko, Lecturer in Development, Security and Leadership, also from the African Leadership Center here at King's. Now, what do relations between the United Kingdom and Africa look like? Now, I'm not talking about the general state of relations, but rather the nature of the conversations they have. There is talk that relations have changed drastically. But really, what does that phrase mean? The British Foreign Secretary, David Lammy, is coming to the end of his first tour of Africa, and the aim is to reset relations with the 54-nation continent. His visit marks the beginning of a 5-month consultation aimed at reshaping UK-Africa relations to prioritize African voices and ambitions across the continent. So let me begin with you, Professor Eka. What does that phrase mean, reset relations? What actually, or even let's begin with assessing what the nature of the relationship between the UK and Africa currently is at the moment.
Thank you very much for that, and good to be here. Now, if we go to where this is coming from, I think the key point to note is this notion of resetting, the notion of newness, the notion to moving to a new space in these interactions. It's important to reflect on where one is coming from around this. At the moment, where when we think of the interactions between the UK and the African continent or African partners in terms of trade, you see a situation where trade remains dominated by high-value UK imports into the African continent and lower-value raw material exports to the UK from the African continent, with a lot of repercussions around that. And in many ways, one can reflect on how coloniality has shaped this relation, the endurance of this pattern in terms of the exchange between these two parts of the world. There have been some shifts and movements. We see the UK is does not play as large a role as a trade partner on the African continent as it used to play. You see the moving of other key global South partners. Nevertheless, in the relationship that is held, you see, especially if you think of the trade sphere, which is a very important space for thinking about the relationship between countries, we see an enduring pattern. And I think that's what the issue is. There might be shifts in it, but the pattern remains the same. Now, in terms of this idea of a new relation, I think it's welcome because you see a recognition that the way things have gone, we need to rethink them. Part of that, of course, is informed by a welcome shift in the way Africa is perceived and understood. Recognition of its agency, a recognition of its dynamism. You think of expansion in terms of digitization, in terms of the use of technology, in terms of innovation around technology as well on the continent. You think of the creative economies that are really showing themselves, and showcasing the best of the African continent on a global stage and being recognized in that regard. Now, you see, I want to reflect on what Lynn Brown, who was the Shadow Minister for Africa, we actually invited her. She was here with us at King's prior to the election in May of this year, I believe it was. And she was very clear that there was a need to move forward, to think of a long-term partnership with Africa that's going to be supporting African interests and moving beyond a donor-recipient relationship. Part of that we saw feed into the Labour Manifesto, where there's a reflection on the need for a new relationship between the UK and Africa that is going to recognize its growing political and economic, the continent's growing political and economic importance, and will deliver a new approach that's able to foster opportunities for mutual long-term benefit. I think this is really, really critical. And we see David Lammy continue this narrative as it reflects on respectful partnerships that listen rather than tell, long-term growth rather than short-term solutions. And then, of course, I think something that's more familiar, a conversation about safer continent, but also speaking about prosperous continent. Sure. I think those are not new. That's always happened.
Let me bring in here Dr. Gallagher. So in view of what Eka has just said in terms of these very fluid and changing dynamics, I mean, political landscapes altering, the trade relationship with the West is almost being rethought of because of the Chinese involvement and all of that. How has the discourse with Africa changed from the UK's point of view? And what actually has changed in that discourse?
Yeah, I think it's minimal, really. So what's always interested me is that it's interesting that we now have a Labour government, and the Labour Party has a long tradition of a particular kind of interest in Africa, which we saw quite pronounced under Tony Blair and Gordon Brown, where there was very much an idea that fed into a kind of paternalistic, moralistic view of Africa as a place where Britain does good. It's about aid, it's about forgiveness of, I'm using inverted commas, forgiveness of debt. And it's sort of very much a kind of idea of a kind of moral superiority, which I think has a long pedigree in Britain and is also actually gained some popular traction, or certainly has done in the past, where, the idea of that Britain's role is to help Africa get out of its difficulties. It seems to sort of catches the imagination, and perhaps is very difficult to shift, I think. When the Conservatives came into power, even David Cameron was quite keen to preserve this because he felt it also was perhaps something which could reflect well on the Conservative Party. If you remember, he had a few stunts where he used to take his MPs out to Rwanda to build schools and unlikely projects like that. Really quite weird for MPs from Britain to be doing in Rwanda. Anyway, under the Conservatives, it definitely then began to move to this more kind of pragmatic, hard-headed, actually, we can't really afford the aid budget. Nobody cares about Africa that much. And certainly some of the right-wing press, the Daily Mail and so on, were very anti anything really that was done in this regard. And then there was much more of a move towards kind of hard-headed trade. What's in it for us? Focusing on big players like Kenya, Nigeria, South Africa, where there are resources that we want. It's worth doing trade with these countries. And I think that was reflected in the sort of some strategic thinking about national security as well, thinking about working with partnerships where we might be supporting initiatives that would prevent migration or would prevent terrorism, that again feeds back into British interests. So I think we're still to see whether the kind of announcement of a change in rhetoric actually leads to anything different. I think David Lammy is really quite interesting, though, because he's got really, really good pedigree on this. He's not just a newbie to this debate, and he's had a long history of being very critical of patronising British attitudes in the kind of comic relief, fundraising, hurrah, let's all be nice to Africa kind of. He hates that, and he's said so. He's spent some political capital on this. So I think I have great hopes that he will really think quite hard about how to reset these relationships and really think about not trying to sort of propagate this patronising approach of doing good, and neither to pursue the kind of sort of really harsh realpolitik, which is also inappropriate, and to think more carefully about it. But I think we still have to see. I think fine words are fine words, but we need to see how it actually develops in reality.
And when you talk to especially young people in Africa, there's oftentimes this sort of uneasy relationship with Britain. So you talk to them and they say, talk about colonialism and all its negative impact. But there's also a lot of reference to the difficulty in getting visas to come to Britain. Now, I know you did a study or a report with the House of Lords back in 2019, I believe. You did an inquiry into UK African relations, and found that a lot of the discourse had to do with that particular subject, the visa. Why so?
I think that was really interesting, and I was really pleased to see that, because it's a major issue for people. I mean, Africans face really racist visa system if they're trying to come to the West and to Europe. I see it just with my African students who can't get visas to go to conferences in other parts of Europe. It's really tough. And actually, there was a lot of discussion about what damage this does to Britain's reputation in Africa. The fact that it's very difficult to come as a student or to come to work, or even just to come on a holiday actually is really, really tough. You have to provide the most extraordinary amounts of information, intimate details about your bank accounts and and your income and things that really very invasive and intrusive questions. And I think that sense of how offensive that can feel was really brought out in discussions, and how actually potentially damaging that is to Britain's relationship with Africa. And I think this kind of idea perhaps of soft power, or Britain's sort of the perspective of Britain as somewhere you would want to go, is really damaged by this. And it does matter. It matters a lot. And I think especially when you have other actors who, as you say, increasingly more important, and are, if you see the way in which China, India, Turkey, other actors are engaging, are helping to build infrastructure and state projects which are reshaping parts of Africa. State buildings like parliaments. I don't know if you know, China has built 15 parliaments in sub-Saharan Africa in recent years. 15. Now, these often replacing colonial era parliaments. That's not necessarily a bad thing, but it's changing what the state looks like. And Britain and other former colonial countries are aware of this. But they don't seem to kind of get their heads around how you actually keep what you ever had of a good relationship alive.
Right. And Clement, I'll come to you in a moment, but let me come back to Eka. So do you think that Britain failed in a way, really, to use avenues such as the Commonwealth, for example, where it has a pretty vast foothold in many African countries, to use that as a means for doing good, but also for changing that narrative in terms of the relationship, revisiting, rethinking, restructuring that narrative around Britain?
Yeah, thank you for that. I mean, I think the challenge is, even when we think of Britain at the center of this is where we begin with the problem. I mean, I appreciate a lot of what Julia has shared there. I think all of it speaking to the coloniality of this relationship, the continuity across time. When you think of the paternalistic approach of the UK over time, that's what it's speaking to. When you think of the visa situation, it's that same coloniality. And when we think of the Commonwealth as a tool for the UK to use to achieve certain things, whatever those things are, when we place the UK at the center of that, this is the problem. And this is why my hope about where the relationship might move to is anchored. I mean, there can only be hope if that shifts that center, if that relationship is about a new conversation about equity, a new conversation about a kind of negotiated mutuality. Because I think mutuality, these are nice words to throw around, but we need to recognize what is going to be possible for the UK and African countries to agree on, and what was going to be more challenging to agree on. I think we saw some of that as you speak of the Commonwealth. We saw some of that at the last set of meetings, where many of the countries in the Commonwealth were insistent on discussing reparative justice, and a UK Labour Prime Minister was insistent on not doing that. And, being the only, one of the very few on one side of the debate, feeling very able to insist that actually that was not going to be a subject of discussion. Now, if the Commonwealth is read as a space where one country, and one country is who's going to decide what we debate and what we don't debate, that's going to be a huge challenge. But of course, we saw that did not hold. That, and in a sense, that's also showing that center is no longer holding. When you see the others, some of what we've heard now, the other partners moving into the space and engagement with African countries, that center is not holding anymore. But I don't want to rest it there, though. I think this conversation also needs to be about the centrality of Africa, the agency of African economies and countries here. So when we think of UK industrial priorities, for example. So, for instance, I think last week there was, there was an announcement that it would be possible to have some benefits. I think in terms of export taxes for firms that were going to be able to go and access critical minerals to secure the UK supply and support UK industrialization. Now, when we think of, the African continent holding about 30% of critical minerals, what does that mean for this new relationship then? It can't simply be about what will serve a British industrial strategy. Where in that discussion can we also be looking at what a policy like that means for the industrial strategies for many African countries. Right. We need to see a situation where we're shifting to a more balanced debate around these issues.
Right. Thank you. So, Clement, let me bring you in on this. So, Eka speaks about, negotiated mutuality. She talks about the agency and also the center not holding, though, using the reference to the recent Commonwealth meeting where almost all the countries wanted to talk about one thing and Mr. Starmer basically says no. So, that being an example in and of itself of a lack of agency, really, how does Africa basically thread this needle? Because when you're talking about agency, you're talking about the narrative changing. There has to be an understanding on both sides that we're equal in this conversation.
Eka has said it right there. That if the conversation is about the UK, and that's really what the Commonwealth is built to be, to center around the UK, the royal family remains, the head of that Commonwealth organization, and it appears that it's still a UK-centric, Western-centric conversation, and even I get the point that there's an effort to make it collective, but to what extent is that possible if you sit on a history of slavery, a history of colonialism? That is the only thing that really ties them together as a Commonwealth, then where will this conversation take us in any case? So I think we can see how to nuance that conversation, that relationship, but I think there has to be a point where the thing that connects people will be more something constructive rather than the history that has destroyed and destabilized and maimed peoples and families and histories. Yeah, so for me, that's a non-starter, to be honest, when you see a Commonwealth as a starting point. But there again, even when you think about globalization and the trade, the networking between countries and the capital system as we have it today, many scholars have argued that that's only just constructed to replace colonialism. And obviously, the evidence of the flow of capital, the reliance on, let's say, the American dollar and the northern countries' currency as a means for trading, it's about the demonstration of that. To what extent can we, assert that there's any African agency, for instance, in that whole conversation? When the Ghanaian currency for the Ghanaian economy is built on how well it does with the US currency, for instance, when the Nigerian naira, for instance, is just on how well it does with the American currency or the British currency. It just begs the question, in terms of where we are and how much agency we can deploy.
And Julia, if I can bring you in. One of your areas of expertise is obviously the nature of the state in Africa. And I just wonder, when we're talking about these engagements with Britain, for example, to what extent are we talking about the sort of the residue really of colonialism informing what the nature of the state itself is, to where it's almost coming to the negotiations as a sort of it's actually inbuilt into the system. And it comes to the negotiations as a sort of a weaker party?
Well, of course, I don't know if the colonial experience will ever not be part of states that have been colonized. Even the language of the state is English in countries that were colonized by Britain. So, if you're, these like English and French and Portuguese have become African languages in many senses, but still these are the languages of the colonizers. And so if you're just starting from the very sort of basic principles of how you organize your parliament or how you understand your law, or there's existing the existing structures from as a sort of basic a thing of where your capital city lives, which is also reflective on what Eke was talking about, that extractive relationship at the beginning. These are fundamental characteristics of states. And I don't think you ever get past those. I mean, even more than 1,000 years on, the British state, it reflects its French colonial heritage. It doesn't go away. It goes
1066.
1066, it's still there. So, in the language we speak, in the way that, the Chancellor of the Exchequer, that's a French term, it will go on. So I don't think it will go. I do think that you have, Africa is an extremely large continent with very different kinds of countries in it. Some of them have dealt with colonialism in very different ways, and some of them have established more comfortable ways of living with the inheritance than in others, and some of them have struggled more than others, and that's for all sorts of factors, partly the colonial histories, but also post-colonial leaders, the way that politics is shaped, the other relationships they have. For many countries, we're talking about 60, 70 years of independence. It's a reasonable amount of time, and a lot has changed. And you have, talking about African agency, you have African leaders who have changed things, and they're not the same places that they were just after colonialism. And that continues, and you will see that continuing. But I don't think you'll ever lose everything that was part of the colonial shaping of the state.
And Eka, if I can ask you, so can you think of, or is it even possible to say that the relationship between the UK and Africa is an honest one in principle, when Britain, for example, doesn't make it its life's work to tear down the institutions of the world that make Africa or put Africa at a disadvantage? I'm thinking initially of the IMF, the World Bank, the United Nations, institutions that have been formed without African involvement, but yet have a direct impact on the way Africa evolves within the international political economy.
I think these global relations are very complex and they're very complicated. And yes, we know that countries like the UK, like the US, hold a lot of power within these constructs, within these spaces. But there are also a lot of conversations to reflect on, multilateral development, finance, and how there's a need to restructure global finance that involves parties that are here in the UK as well.
So again, Britain's sitting at the top seat of these global organizations, the IMF, the World Bank, part of the Bretton Woods project and all of that, building this international financial mechanism that Africa is a part of now, but Africa was never a part in building. Can Britain have an effective discourse or interaction with Africa without the question of, say, reparations coming up, or the question of paying for slavery, or, paying for debts of the past?
So thank you for that question. Let me move it in this direction. If we take, and I think that's one of the first things you'd asked me, can we, if you like, take this proposal for a way forward? Can we take it at face value? Can we try and think of moving forward in this moment? I think there's still room to have a genuine conversation, but it would need to be based on principles. It would need to be based on certain values. And I think those values would need to be around thinking about equity, right? Forms of equity. It would need to be thinking about partnership. And this point was made. I think I like this reference to the logic or the idea, the notion of a long-term partnership, respectful partnership would have to be built on respect. Now, if we're thinking about a new relationship between the United Kingdom and Africa, and we accept that this needs to be based on certain principles, and we've heard the Labour Party reflect on this idea of respectful partnerships, a longer term agenda. We've heard of ideas of mutual long-term benefits. I think a space where we could bring this to is the very pivotal African Continental Free Trade Area. Now, this is an agenda that Africans themselves have organized. They've organized themselves around. I think it was intriguing when I was listening to Julia speak about states in Africa and how they continue to hold that a part of that colonial legacy will always shape their construct. Something that is interesting and intriguing about African states is their commitment to a regional agenda, a continental agenda, a recognition that, yes, we might have inherited these states and we have to move through the world with these states. That's what we have, right? And in the post-independence period, I also like that reference to the post-independence period. It was a pivotal period that has been very important for liberation on the continent, right? So we speak of this hierarchy between the UK and African countries, but I know my own country, Nigeria, how it stood up to the UK government to insist it would not sell petroleum to the UK as part of the struggle against apartheid in South Africa. So it is possible to deploy, this construct of the state to certain ends. And I think you see that collective coalescing around the idea of, of collectivism. Right. And that is in part linked to the wisdom, the knowledge, the understanding about the way the global economy is structured. It's an understanding of the reality of the global political economy hierarchy, global political economy hierarchy, the reality that these economies are younger than many others, the reality that they are shaped by coloniality. They've come together and they've said, actually, we will be stronger as a collective unit. They've done that. And I think one of the shining lights of that agenda is the African Continental Free Trade Area. Clement had earlier referenced the challenges of dollarization. They have put in place a payments platform that means it will be possible to trade in African currency. So this is the kind of agency we're talking about. A relationship that is about equity and mutuality, I would expect, therefore, to turn to an initiative like this and to recognize that actually this is the voice. If we're coming into mutual respect, if we're saying also respect for long-term relationships, then it's to come and say, how can we journey with you to support your brainchild, right? To me, these are journeys into reparation. The damage that has been done to the continent, reparation it's not going to be one word. Yeah. It's going to be layers and layers of conversations that we have to have, that we're going to have to unpick. Even the idea of reparation differs. Julia, I think, was very clear about everyone will read this differently, will see this differently. But there are spaces that the UK can set. And so how might it support that? We also know that when we think of, again, another agenda that's very linked to the African Continental Free Trade Area is one of industrial strategy, one of industrial development. But we know that for a lot of industrialists on the African continent, finance is hugely expensive. And the African private sector is penalized by this high cost. Now, what can the UK do in a space and in a context like this? How can the UK also negotiate mutuality within that? Because that's not easy and straightforward, right? How is it going to have that conversation with its own population? How is it going to make the case that actually this is to our benefit? So I think talking about mutual benefits like a lovely thing it's not going to be easy. Yeah. So are you ready to have the difficult conversations about that? So yes, as I mentioned before, you have a policy in place where export finance can be, you're saying you want your own British industrialists to go and get these critical minerals all over the world. How can you make a case for, right, you may get those minerals, but what will you leave behind that doesn't continue that extractivist logic? Are you going to think about upgrading some of those critical minerals in those spaces? Are you going to think about how those communities should be using those critical minerals themselves? That is what I am expecting if we're serious about conversation about equity and mutuality and a long-term partnership. Yeah.
Julia, let me bring you in quickly on this one. So a lot of also the criticism that's been floated around is the toxicity of aid, as people see it, that it's not just a freebie for these countries in Africa, that it actually does come with a lot of bad strings attached in a way. And I'm just thinking in terms of the financialization of aid, to where, aid packages are sent through, but then also you have to do something in terms of building something that tends to benefit Britain, for example, in terms of being the donor of that aid. Again, with your expertise on the state in Africa, to what extent has the state in Africa failed to stand up and say, no, up with this, we will not put?
Yeah, I think that's a very good question and quite a painful question. Incidentally, that idea of mutual benefit, that aid was given in return for it being used to support British industry, is actually an old 1960s Labour Party initiative. It came from the Labour Party. Not many people know that. I think it's difficult. I mean, it's very easy to slip into a kind of argument that says African leaders have no power to say no or to make conditions for how these things work. And to some extent, that has been the case. It's certainly in smaller countries or more aid-dependent countries that there is a big power differential, and it is difficult. I think also it is the case that in some places, aid has been quite useful to certain elites who've been able to, use it as a resource that helps support themselves or support their own position. And that can be problematic too. There are plenty of examples of where that's happened. And aid itself creates a kind of, I just think it's a deeply unhelpful basis of a relationship of mutuality. So I think, but I also, what I want to say is that I think that sometimes there has been more agency in African elites being able to say no or yes, or how they're going to use aid, or even to attract aid by promising certain things. So sometimes it's certainly been the international financial institutions that come in and say, we want X, Y, Z if you're going to get aid. Sometimes it has been on the initiative of certain African governments to say, well, we're doing X, Y, Z, so can you bring the aid in? Saying the right kinds of things, and it's unhealthy on both sides. So I think there is a very powerful argument that says aid is actually, in the long term, even in the medium term, even in the short term, sometimes damaging, and really ought to be something that we try everything we can on all sides to get past.
Now, Clement, let me bring you in. So Julia talked a bit about what she described as this big power differential, and I'm assuming she means the sort of imbalance between Britain and some of these countries in Africa. Now, you teach leadership as well at the African Leadership Center here at King's. To what extent has a failure in leadership continued to contribute to that power differential?
Yeah, I'll speak about the power differential in a moment, but I thought I would reflect also on the question of aid and how good or bad it is. And I think it depends on how you conceptualize aid. When you see aid as a package that includes things like restorative justice occasioned by the injustices of colonialism and globalization, then there cannot be any question about whether it is necessarily good or bad. It becomes more a question of the how. So I would concern myself with the question, how is the aid being delivered? So who are involved in deciding what's being delivered and for what purpose, and also what intention is behind the giving and the receiving. I lean more towards this way of understanding of the intent and the how and the why. Now, a typical example, and I'll bring you to, this recent conversation we had, is a kind of aid that plays out in the discussions about financing climate change, climate action at COP29. The whole conversation about who finances the mitigation, adaptation and loss and damages of climate change, it's nothing more than a conversation about aid properly so-called, if you see what I mean. But it's more conceived in terms of restorative justice due to historical overexploitations by developed countries that has caused most of the climate mess as we see. So in a way, that can bring that now to the question of leadership. And the other point you were asking about what role leadership has to play.
The power differential.
Yeah. Obviously, the structure, as we've said, of the global economy makes power differentials imbalanced in so many ways, because we live in a neoliberal system where development is conceived in a certain way. But we could break that trend if we have leaders who can, hold their own and be assertive and, like you said, have more agency that can counterbalance, the kind of Western agency we have. But that's also been difficult historically. And, we've been having this conversation, Esau. If you see the way African leaders, for instance, in the past have been assertive and done all the things that need to be done, and yet they don't live to see the other day just because they are doing the right things, right? You think of Thomas Sankara, you think of Patrice Lumumba, and there are even modern day examples you can think about. And the fact that the creme de la creme who could have made a difference couldn't live to make the difference means that power imbalance has always been there, and the moment there's any possibility of tilting it, there's a blot that's often, masterminded by people who just don't want that to be the case. And so, so that's a problem, and until we get to the point where we can really innovate to provide a counterbalancing system, not to overthrow what we have, but to balance it up. Then it's that power imbalance is going to be there in terms of leadership.
In terms then of Africa recovering its agency on the global stage, would that necessarily then require it to reach out to quote unquote new allies, China, Russia, who may not have the best intents of the continent at heart, but still will do the dirty business of, well, you know what, we're equals. Here's your money. Give me your stuff.
Yes, no, I think it's a very good point. I want to, build on this conversation about leadership, but I think it connects very nicely to this. I want, when we say recover agency, there's always been agency. I don't think that is it's not I think it's also important that we're complicated. And I know we've said Africa, and there's always a risk with that, which I think is a healthy risk. Because on the one hand, the onus is on us to recognize the diversity and the complexity of the continent. But the continent is also a very unique place that has both that diversity and complexity, but also organizes itself as on the basis of collectivism. So it's not the reason why we struggle with that is because there's an intentionality on the African continent about that. There's an agency that is about organizing itself in this way for some of the reasons that we discussed earlier, especially as part of the anti-colonial project, if you like. Now, in terms of, when we speak of agency, I think there are also silences around the agency that has been on the continent. A big example that comes to my mind was the struggle against the 1980s period of structural adjustment program. Structural adjustment programs across the continent, and some may be familiar with the, this was around addressing the major crisis of debt on the continent following the late 1970s into the early 1980s. And, a big factor that characterizes this period is one of the conditionalities that were placed on the continent, very rooted in neoliberal ideas of economic, of the economy, if you like. Now, in that period, there was a very well-reasoned, thought-through response in the African Alternative to Structural Adjustment Program that was put in place by Professor Adedeji, who used to head the United Nations Economic Commission for Africa. It was an incredibly innovative agenda for change, for transformation, a collective idea that came from the continent, but utterly silenced. You have to go and dig in certain archives to even know that such a thing ever existed. And there are countless examples of other such situations where you have had this resistance and this clear effort to address that. Clement highlighted some of the leaders that readily come to our minds, but there are others in other spaces beyond the national level that we know have been doing a great deal of work to sort of challenge the status quo. Now, when we think of interactions, and I heard you with what we may call other global South contexts and spaces that we've seen, especially since the 2000s, that has been a form of agency, a sort of recognition, sort of negotiation with the global system, right? Thinking, where else will we get the resources for some of what we really genuinely need? We heard in the conversation earlier about the kind of infrastructural development that has gone on the continent, certainly since the 2010s. That's been absolutely crucial. If you think of the sort of transport infrastructure that has been taking place, that has been linked to relationships with these other global South actors. Of course, China is the one that often comes to our mind in a very critical way. And that's been part of, playing off some of these actors against each other, which is how the global economy, unfortunately, this very extractive model tends to work. That's what we're even seeing today amongst all economies in the globe, if you like. Now, we see this has to be a form of agency, and it's the extent to which to what end is the big question for me. To what end? What is the agenda to this? What kind of transformation do these kinds of interactions need to be organized around? Yeah, what is the thread that all of this needs to be feeding into, right? And so we can criticize some of that, but on the other hand, I also want to say we must leave room for trial and error. We must leave room for efforts that are being made. I think it's Professor Thandika Nkandawire, who used to be based at the London School of Economics, who said, when we think of African context, think of that post-independence period, there are ways in which that those efforts are erased because of, change in circumstances. And it's very important that we remain complex in how we read the continent, how we think about it, how we recognize that contradictions are possible. You can have forms of progress and you can have challenges. You can have leaders who are very forthright, who are very promising in particular ways, but very challenging in other ways. And I think if we look at the present day, there is no doubt that there are really interesting things going on in a country like Rwanda. For example, if you think of the role of the state, if you think of the efforts around certain ideas of economic development. And there are ways in which I think leaders in other parts of the world are read as complicated, that when you come onto the African continent, everything is black or white. Everything is flat. Yeah.
And Julia, just finally to you, do you think there is a sufficient understanding among the British establishment, for example, of the complexities of Africa? Or is it the easy, simple, caricatures of Africa? Do they get it?
I don't think they do, to be perfectly honest. If I have to fall down one side or the other, no. I think there's still a lot of very simplistic thinking, tendencies to block the continent together, to talk about wisdom and proverbs and hero, sort of saintly characters or villains, and in very sort of, I think what Eke was just saying about the kind of idea of complexity is very difficult for British heads. They like to think of it in very simplified, simplistic ways. It really does flow from the kind of colonial ideas about, blank canvas or, tabula rasa that we're going to go in and create good things, or, seeing complicated political discussions, difficult dilemmas being faced, characters or politicians who have ideas but also have flaws, but are complicated, as politicians everywhere all over the world are. That's more difficult, and I think that's really important. I think that kind of sense of, that sort of idea of the complexity of the continent and the complexity of people in it and the complexity of ideas and the fact that there are ideas and there are ideologies and there are things happening. That is something which we just, I think as academics, we are constantly trying to reinforce and press and help people to come to understand in this country, certainly something that I've sort of tried to do.
Fantastic. So just before I go, we have a habit on the podcast of asking each of you what key issues in your areas of expertise you're going to be keeping an eye on over the next week or so. So, Julia, since you last spoke, what are you focused on? She nods furiously, nothing. Clement, how about you?
Look, I've just returned from COP29, and I'm very much focused on, those who are sitting in between the big conversations, and ordinary people who just want to have meaningful life and are not worried about the big technologies or the simplistic argument. And that really sit in the core of justice, energy justice in the transitions, which I'm really interested in. And so, post-COP, I'm just, keeping an eye on that to see how, that whole conversation transitions down to the ordinary conversations on the street.
Okay. And Eka, what are you going to be focusing on over the next week or so?
I think I have to take a moment to reflect a little bit on it. I should have taken that as a warning. Maybe Fanny knows what she's thinking over the next week.
We'll go to Fanny then. Fanny, what have you been thinking of? Don't tell me about the Austrian Alps now.
I currently work at the European Bureau of Conservation and Development. So obviously next week will be another plenary in Strasbourg. The dialogue between the EU at COP and what finance gap, and also what Clement said, how that will now be received and talked about at the next plenary.
All right, so let's go to Julia.
I'm really interested to see what David Lammy says when he gets back, and actually whether there's something substantial in what he has to say, whether he's learned something from his visit.
And Eka, last chance saloon.
Well, I'm really interested in conversations about the creative economies in parts of the African continent, having looked at Nigeria, Kenya in some depth, thinking also about the role of state capital around that. And I think having had this conversation, I'd be intrigued in because I think that's an area of incredible vibrant. So you speak about agency, incredible agency. So Africa to Africa agency, innovation, real excitement, but also African innovation and excitement on the global stage. So I'd be interested to hear, also about how the UK might reflect on interactions with these very dynamic spaces and the place of sort of equity, mutuality in interactions with this space. I'd be intrigued in how one may. I'll be trying to pick that out and try and see what does equity, what does mutuality, what might that look like. I think there were some references to thinking about these spaces in this moment as well. But we don't want just any kind of interaction. I think it needs to be founded and to be thinking really seriously about these questions of equity and a kind of negotiated mutuality. Yeah.
Excellent. Eka Ikpe, Julia Gallagher, Fanny Dreyer, and Clement Sefa-Nyarko. Thank you all very much indeed for your company over the last hour or so. This has been World We Got This podcast. I am Esau Williams. Until the next time, cheerio.